Good morning, everybody. And I'm glad that we are transitioning from the previous discussion. Actually, both discussions this morning were somewhat related to attracting investments and what can a country do in terms of being more efficient, digitalizing, reducing corruption, and at the same time, Mr. Andreas Kostal, who happens to be my boss at the same time, gave relevant information how and why a country is chosen. So I'm very glad that today we have two very esteemed panelists who will give us their perspective on what and how a country can think about attracting investment, but also how can a company think about choosing a location where to invest. And first we have Eileen Sharpe. Eileen Sharpe is coming from Ireland. If we think globally, from a country perspective, who has been the most successful in terms of attracting investment and transforming the society, I think Ireland will be the showcase. And not only in Europe, but in the world. And Eileen has been working for the IDA, which is the government authority responsible for attraction, for nourishing, for reinvestment and economic development of the country. She's been working for almost 30 years, started her career as a marketing representative in Hong Kong, and now she's a senior member of the executive leadership team, and I think she can give us the country perspective, how our country, which is an island off of an island, became one of the highest countries with the GDP per capita in Europe. And we also have Dr. Martin Kaspar, a German gentleman who comes from the business sector. He's a corporate development executive in a German Mittelstand company, but at the same time, he's a thought leader on international business development, on attracting of FDIs, and on expertise on investment promotion agencies. So he can give us perspective from the practical standpoint, but also from an academic standpoint, what is the forefront of FDI attraction. So I'm going to start the discussion with Martin, actually. Martin, let me ask you from a company's perspective. You think about new investment location. You're looking at various countries in one continent, in multiple continents. What are the main aspects? How does the business think? What are the main drivers that you expect governments, locations, cities, regions to not only present themselves, but what type of information you're looking for before you make that initial, let's say, decision of 3 to 4 countries that you go into the deep dive?
Thank you. Quite a difficult task to follow Andreas Kostal, who largely stolen the thunder on that question already. So this is really difficult now. I think there are 3 points corporates like myself would really be looking at this point in time. One is sort of the regulatory environment within which you're sort of operating, and sort of the regulatory environment the country is in or offers you as a corporate. The second is access to talent. How do I find people, and how do I find qualified people? And in terms of thinking about IPAs, to me, one of the most important things is aftercare. And I would argue at the same time, this is probably one of the most neglected areas within IPAs. In terms of the regulatory environment, if you think about sort of Western-style, liberal, open economies, there is, I would say, a really good example, that being Singapore. It's very open, very business-friendly. And at the moment, there is sort of another end of the spectrum, if I could say so, and that is the European Union, because it is going into some sort of regulatory overdrive at the moment, with a whole range of different regulations coming out. And if we're thinking about governments, and if we're thinking about IPAs, I think this is really important, and this is the reason why I'm bringing it up here. You really have a major role to play in this. You really can sort of change the course of the decision of an investor, whether they go here or whether not. If you look at it from our perspective, if I go into Singapore, this is super easy. They're at rank number 2 in the Ease of Doing Business Index. I mean, literally everybody can set up a factory in Singapore, a company. I mean, if you can't do that, you probably shouldn't be in business. If you think about Europe, And sort of the countries of Europe are very disparate. I mean, some are relatively easy and straightforward, others are really, really difficult and relatively low in the ranking and ease of doing business ranking. So you start with a difficult situation already, and now you have a volley of regulation coming out, one after the other, sort of the supply chain law, the deforestation regulation, the sustainability reporting, the taxonomy. I mean, there is a regulatory tsunami hitting the companies that is really difficult. But that's sort of the silver lining on the horizon, in a way, I would say. Difficult times are always fantastic opportunities to differentiate yourselves. This is the legal context within which we're working. But as an IPA, if as a government, you can help companies, if you can do capacity building, if you can do support, if you have special advice on this, you really drive investment in your direction. And I don't think I'm putting it too strongly when I say the regulatory environment at the moment has the impact of direct or redirect investment flows. If you're really helpful, if you're really supportive, you're actually redirecting investment in your direction. The second point I'd say is sort of the access to talent, and I don't think there is a great surprise in this. I mean, the demography of Europe being what it is, it's really difficult to find talent, to find employees, and it's even more difficult to find well-educated people. And sort of, I'm taking a leaf out of Andreas Kostal's a talk up here just a minute ago. And this is a purely personal opinion, and you probably totally agree with me on this, but I know that makes for more interesting panels, I guess. I would say forget about fiscal and financial incentives. They have their point in certain instances, but if you spend that money on education, you're so much better served. If you have a business context that works, it's so much more useful. I mean, I won't lie to you. As a corporate, if there is free money at the table, we take it, gracefully so. And maybe even mumble something about the importance of incentives. But I will not locate a factory, a smart factory, if I don't have the people that can run it. I don't locate a factory where there isn't the market to sell my products. And incentives don't change that. And I think we talk way too much about incentives and we talk way too little about education, and I really would urge you to change that. And a very brief last point, and that is a personal bugbear of mine, aftercare. I find it fascinating that there is report after report coming out of UNCTAD and OECD saying, depending on the country, between 50 to 70% of FDI flows are the reinvestments of already existing foreigners in the country. And the same reports say 3/4 of the budget of IPAs goes into promotion, goes into lead generation, goes into marketing campaigns. I mean, it isn't true forever. If you're a small country, you need to draw attention to yourself. Absolutely true. I'm not entirely sure why Germany, the US, or the UK feels the need to draw attention to themselves. I mean, money would be so much better spent on either facilitation or on aftercare. And in a political sense, I get that. And it's wonderful to have the ribbon-cutting ceremonies, it's wonderful to have the great names. But at the end of the day, I think you need to decide whether you want to have investment flows or nice headlines. And in that, I don't think there is a better investment for a country than having a really strong aftercare department.
Thank you, Martin. I tend to agree with quite a few things that you said, but I'll follow up with a couple of questions. Let me ask now, Eileen, from a government perspective, from an investment promotion and investment facilitation agency, how you look into these things that Martin mentioned, but also what has Ireland done? Give us a little bit of a history. You started as an authority, I guess, in the late 40s, and then with some transformation from the 60s to today. So over 60 years, Ireland has been working in this process. How did Ireland develop from a country of those years post-war, post-World War II, to where you are today?
Well, first of all, thank you, Viktor, and thanks for inviting me here today. And just to say, Mr. Kostal, it really is a pleasure to be on the same stage as you. the Costel family are investors in Ireland for many, many years, and they're very, very valued. And if I can also just mention a very good close colleague of the Costel family and yourself, Chris Saunders, who invited me here, and just to acknowledge Chris's presence here today. Okay. Well, I thought about this, how I was going to approach it actually, Victor, and I think the first thing is to say that from, I suppose, like what is FDI to Ireland, right? IDA Ireland, it's a government agency where our mandate is to find, develop and build, which I was very impressed with your aftercare reference, because that is 50% of our energy goes into aftercare, so I thought that was very interesting. And the whole ethos behind it is, one, to provide jobs, two, to provide economic impact for Ireland, and three, opportunities for the people of Ireland. So I think to understand the sort of the economic impact, which is so important in terms of FDI, I did bring a few numbers, which, if you don't mind, I'll have to read. And these are some of the latest figures. So in terms of direct employment, IDA-related companies employs 300,000 people. These companies, the economic expenditure on an annual basis is about 35.8 billion. So you can imagine what that does to an economy. In terms of annual spend by FDI companies in Ireland, it's 3.8 billion per year. The FDI companies are responsible for 383 billion per year, with an annual capital investment of about 15.5 billion. Now, I know I'm rattling off numbers. And in terms of R&D, we talked about shifting and evolving, roughly 1.4 billion per year. So that has a really big economic impact in Ireland, and the purpose of those numbers was just to say it's really important. It's really important. And IDA takes its role very, very seriously. And it takes its role very seriously in terms of working closely with its investors such as the Costel family. We're very structured, we're very organised, we've been at this a long time. So in terms of geographies, essentially there are 4 geographies. There's the United States, there's Britain, there's the Europe, and then what we call growth markets, which is everywhere that doesn't fall into the first 3 categories. Our main market is the United States, and we have people all over the US. In UK, our main office is in London, and in Europe, it's in Germany. Germany is a very, very important market for IDA. And then outside of that, we have our what we call growth markets. So within that, we have 3 tiers, but probably the primary markets are Japan, India, and China. I heard the reference to China earlier on this morning about Chinese investment. Chinese investment has been very good to Ireland. We only went into China in 2003. So in 2018, we secured the largest greenfield investment into Europe, went into Ireland, and that was 1.7 billion in the biopharmaceutical space. So there are some very important there is some very important business coming out of China as well. So I suppose that's our geographical stance. We operate vertically in terms of sectors. Our primary sectors are engineering and green economy, technology-related business, life sciences, both biopharmaceutical, pharmaceutical, as well as medical technologies, and then international financial services is a big business for us. And then horizontally, we work with these companies across a whole range of businesses from end to end in the value chain, really, from research and development right through to end delivery and across. So I'm rabbiting on a bit, actually, Victor. I suppose just to finish this segment by saying we're doing very well. Last year we brought in just under 250 investments into Ireland. of which a significant portion were new name investments. Of that, about just slightly over 50% of those investments went into what we call regional locations. That means locations outside of the main city centres. So a lot of work in terms of strategic planning and delivery goes into ensuring that we continue to deliver on those numbers.
Yeah. Thank you, Eileen. Martin, if I can go back to something that you stated, and please elaborate a little further. Your point of view about incentives versus talent. A government can say, okay, yes, we have certain talent, certain knowledge, but it takes time to develop talent based on the needs of the investors today and based on the needs of the investors in the next 5 to 10 years. Just because you'll invest a lot in a new engineering department in a university does not mean that the engineers come out 2 days from now. So sometimes the government can say, well, I'll throw a lot of money at them for training, of job creation grants, whatever, capital investment grants, and maybe on the talent they'll bring expats at the beginning, versus the long-term sustainability of talent creation. How will you view that from a perspective of an investor?
Absolutely true. I mean, there is a pot of money and you can only spend that money once. I totally get that conundrum, but if you don't start with education at some point, you will never get to that point. And I think it's probably also important to recognize the perspective the business community is taking on these things. If you see that steps are being taken in that direction, I think that is also considered. I mean, the money you spend on incentives is kind of gone as soon as it is out of your bank account. There is no additional value other than the company being there, which is a value in its own right. If you use that money on education, I think you have a number of different benefits. You have a better qualified workforce, which stands you well in the global competition for investment, but also in sort of the slightly more longer term. We're standing on the precipice of a new paradigm. We're standing sort of on the verge of a new time, and we don't really quite know where we're going. Are we going for full robotics, IoT, lights out factories, and everything is sort of automated? Are we going for asset-light investment? I don't know, is there a remnant of globalization still there? Do we still have global production networks? What we know is that sort of the way how we do business is changing and is automating, and you can't sell yourself on being a low-cost location. You need to sell yourself on knowledge, you need to sell yourself on expertise, because this is where we're going. So I would call that sort of an insurance into the future as well. If you spend the money on incentives, you have companies who might decamp the year after that. There is zero insurance. So I think you need, and I think that is generally true for investment promotion agencies, and I think IDA is a perfect example for that. You need to think like business people. You need to speak the language of business people. You need to understand what drives them and how they operate. And that is what sort of should determine what you're doing, and maybe not the easy way of sort of shoving money across the table and then, having a wonderful headline for the next year.
Very, very interesting point that you made at the end, because I want to ask Eileen on that. People in the investment promotion agencies should think like business people. How are you organized? In many instances, especially countries maybe in this region, in the Balkans or in Eastern Europe, how do you delineate between politics and a professional agency? How do you find the right staff with the right skill set to be able to speak to all these companies with various fields you mentioned, from engineering to life sciences to financial services? I assume those people have to have professional knowledge and expertise, not just to be regular civil servants in order to be able to speak with those type of companies.
Yeah, Viktor, absolutely. We take it very seriously. So, Michael mentioned education. So most of our people would be educated to master's level, and we'd have a significant portion of people with PhDs. Because we know that to send people out to talk to potential investors all over the world, you need to be credible. You need to be credible. And to be credible, you need to have the knowledge. And to have the knowledge, you need to go to school and you need to be educated. So it all comes back to there. In terms of politics versus business, we're business focused. We don't get involved in politics at all. In terms of our structures, I think Michael spoke about regulation. Some regulation is good, right? So for us, we are an independent agency, but we report into a government department. The government department is headed by the minister. There's a very short line between our clients and the decision makers, the policy makers and the decision makers, and we believe that has been key, as we have developed and evolved over the year. So if Mr. Costel, for example, has an issue and he wants to discuss it with either the Minister or the Prime Minister, we'll arrange that in days. So that short line between emphasising the importance of the investor to the politicians is very important. The other thing I wrote down when Michael was talking there, like knowledge expertise, it's absolutely critical. But we like to go on the journey with investors, okay? And that journey can have ups and downs, okay? It can have ups and downs. And you need to stick with the investors in the bad times and work with them in the good times. I think on the question of incentives, I think it would be a wonderful world if incentives weren't needed, right? But sometimes the reality is very different. Okay, I totally agree with Michael that you don't want to go down the route of lowest possible denominator and cheap is best. But there's a reality to business as well. That means that financial incentives can be very powerful. And they can be very powerful in a knowledge and expertise sense. So if we look at the way business is evolving at the moment, and we look at things like digitization, and we look at efforts in the sustainability area, being able to provide, I wouldn't call it even incentives, I would call it support to companies to be able to accelerate their digitization program, to accelerate their decarbonisation program, that's all good. That's all very good. The world of incentives has changed a lot. So the competition in terms of incentives is different. And a lot of it is down to research and development and very highly sophisticated operations. The incentives don't, you're absolutely right, Michael, they don't, that's not the decider. There's a whole myriad of factors, and I agree with Michael that the education, the quality of the workforce, the availability of the workforce, the flexibility of the workforce, knowledge and expertise, they're the critical component.
Martin, I think you want to say something on the incentives, but as a follow-up also I want you to give a little bit of more in-depth this definition on how do you think the aftercare relevance is important? Because in many instances, I think a company invests for the first time and everybody's happy, but nobody thinks in the background how many other things are needed for the people that work in that company to persuade the headquarters that that's a good place for reinvestment, and then what can, both from a business perspective but also from a government perspective, used as an encouragement tool for that growth and reinvestment.
Yeah. Okay, so if I can have a comeback on 2 points. One, your question about the IPA. And I think it probably is best if you have both in there. If you have civil servants in there who manage to get you through the regulatory maze, who know how the government works, and you have business people in there who speak the language of the business people, understand, okay, this is where they're really having a problem. And I think only if you have both in tandem, it works really well. If you have agencies that are sort of purely staffed by private business people, I don't think they're not particularly efficient. If you have them purely staffed by civil servants, I don't think they're very efficient. It's the combination of both. In terms of incentives, totally agree with Eileen. It is super important to define what we understand as incentives. And if it is capacity building in terms of allowing for digitalization, if it is training activities, I have no problem with that. If it is purely shoving checks across the table, I don't think they're particularly efficient and they're not doing much. So in that respect, I mean, incentive is always a bit of a catch-all term, and I think the nuance is sort of in the detail. But sort of if you attend IPA conferences, I don't know, or if I go into a country, and I always find that quite a curious moment. You go into certain locations, you talk to the people of the IPA, and if the second sentence is, oh, by the way, you have incentives, I always have this slight lingering feeling, so what's wrong with you that you need to talk about money in the first two sentences? So if you get the business context right, you can talk about that very late in the day, it doesn't really matter then. As for your question about aftercare, well, it's a difficult one. I think first and foremostly, stay in touch. Over the last 14 years, I've built 9 production plants for the group I'm working for. Of those 9 production plants, we have 1 country where the IPA is keeping in touch with us. In 8, we haven't heard of them. So as soon as you have the ribbon cutting ceremony, as soon as you've signed on the dotted line, whoop, they evaporate. And I think that is not a good way. In particular, given the fact that, as we said, the majority is reinvestments. So as an IPA, you need to really speak to the people on the ground. What are their problems? What are their gripes? Do they have difficulties? Because when it comes to reinvestments, there is the whole topic again. How do I get the permits? I mean, what's the whole scenario again? If you're not in the conversation, if you're not there, and most companies have, say, 5 different locations in Europe. If there is one location that is super eager, it's probably going there if you need to expand your capacity in Europe rather than somewhere else. I don't think I can overemphasize the importance of an IPA. And Mr. Costal said exactly the same thing if you listen to it. It was the active engagement, it was the eagerness. Because again, if you look at it from the perspective of a corporate, you go in another country, you don't know the rules of the game. I mean, there are the known knowns, you know what you need to do, you just need to do it. There are the known unknowns. I know I need to pay taxes. I have no idea how I pay taxes in Macedonia, but this is why God invented the tax advisors. So I go to them. The dangerous things are the unknown unknowns, the problems of which I don't know that I have them and I need to deal with them. And that is what IPAs should focus on. At the beginning when you get into it, but also later on. And it is the continuous contact with the local entity, but also with the headquarter. Because if you're a local entity and times are bad, companies are probably cutting down on production plants. And this is the moment where suddenly the local management and the IPA are the best buddies because they're fighting both for exactly the same topic, to keep that plant in that country alive. So it is a question of the perspective, but the most important thing is stay in touch. And the best reason to stay in touch, which is an ongoing problem, is the education, is the talent, is how do you educate people. And that goes back to what you said at the beginning. If governments create special courses on engineering, on cybersecurity, whatever, this is a wonderful reason to keep talking to those business people in your country.
Thank you, Martin. A couple of questions from the audience, but also what I wanted to ask. You mentioned about taxation. First of all, Ireland for a very long time has been known as a country in the European Union with flat tax of 12.5%. And I think that was something that was very important in the whole process, especially at the beginning in the FDI attraction. Recently, we were one of the last 2 countries in the European Union and within the OECD group that were reluctant but ultimately accepted the global corporate tax, minimum corporate tax of 15%. We as a country have had flat corporate tax of 10%, and large companies, not only ours, but many other FDIs in the country, now have to start adapting to these new rules. What does that adaptation for Ireland mean, and was that the big hurdle to give up your lower tax rate?
Just by way of clarity, there wasn't any reluctance. There was, these things need to be worked through, so that wasn't an indication of any reluctance, and Ireland has fully embraced it, genuinely fully embraced it. And just a point of clarity as well, at the beginning it wasn't 12.5%, it was actually 10%.
Okay.
So, okay, just by way of clarity. So, actually, of course, it represented a big change. It represented a big change. But what we found, actually, we have circa 1,400 clients, and I would say the vast majority, and by the vast majority, I mean with a number of very small exceptions that you could go on one hand, all of the clients embraced it. So it wasn't problematic, and I think it wasn't problematic because of what Michael said earlier. The operating environment, what investors value is the totality of the operating environment. One aspect of that is tax. But the critical portions are the enthusiasm in the country, within the government system for business, skills, availability of labour, support and help with the right type of building, land, infrastructure, capacity, water, power, etc. So there's a totality of reasons why investors come in. But do you mind if I go back to something Michael said, because I think it's important in terms of the follow-through. So the way we manage that in IDA, and we've been reasonably successful, half of our resources are actually dedicated to managing, minding and building investment from existing investors. So as soon as an investor is landed, an executive is allocated to that, to work with that company, and that executive is given some targets that they need to reach, whether it's upskilling on digitisation, on training, on decarbonisation, or expanding in terms of numbers. So the emphasis on managing the existing clients is just as strong, arguably stronger, than new name investments. So I'm absolutely agreeing with what you're saying.
Thank you. Martin, what about local supply chain and integration of the local economy with the supply chain when you go in a new country as a new investor? How easy is that? Is that the job of you as an investor? Is that the job of the government? Or is that a joint cooperation in order to get there over time?
It is super important, and I think the way how the world is changing, it is getting more important still. For a very long time, we sort of operated on global production networks. We tended to have very long supply chains, and we sort of shipped goods around the world, either within the group or sort of from trusted suppliers. The more you can integrate into the local economy, the better it is, because you sort of massively shorten your supply chain, which significantly increases the stability of your business. In that respect, yes, absolutely. I would, and that is, in my view, that is always a case with pretty much everything we're talking about in terms of FDI attraction. It depends massively on the type of company you're talking about. The smaller the companies are, the more Mittelstands companies, sort of, excuse the reference to the German worldview, sort of the more Mittelstand the company is, the more likely it is that you have close integration with the local community around, because you don't have everything in-house. If you think about Siemens or the big corporations, they have fully complete integrated supply chains within their own enterprise, and obviously very often favor their own manufacturing sites. So in that regard, I would say smaller companies tend to be more effort for IPAs, tend to be more, cumbersome because they don't know the rules of the game quite as well. There's more explaining. But all along, for sort of the stability of the local economy, I think they're a better deal for you.
Eileen, we've been operating in a new geopolitical global environment, especially that has been the case since February 2022 with the onset of the war in Ukraine. European Union has started and really sped up the whole process of investment screening. In which way member states of the European Union are going through a very thorough process of checking where the investment is coming from, whether that's Russia, Belarus, China, etc. We as a country also are in the process of going through and implementing, most likely in the near future, an investment screening mechanism that will comply with the European rules and regulations. We know that the Americans have been doing that for probably 30, 40 years. How is Ireland living in this environment? You mentioned very important Chinese investments are coming there. Is this something that is about national security, or is this about development where you really make a right decision what type of investment is allowed in the country and what can benefit the country?
Well, we are in the process, like yourselves, of actually implementing the investment screening protocol in line with EU regulations. It's important to remember, of course, that investment screening is about all third countries. It's not necessarily about one country or another. It's applicable to all third countries. So for us, we are absolutely apolitical, and as I said, the bulk of our investment comes from the United States of America. The second highest investor for us is Europe, and within Europe, it's Germany 1, UK 2. Europe is Europe, the geography didn't change. And we're also seeing significant investment now from the Nordics. And then within the context of the East, Asia and Japan. So we are absolutely apolitical.
Thank you. Martin, when you're an industrial company, you go to a new country, certainly that's because of manufacturing first and foremost. But how do you think about that new location to potentially be an engineering, an R&D center? How long does it take to make that type of decision? Because the value addition that is created in the country, the type of jobs and the skills that are generated are certainly more important from the government side, but also for your side, that means longevity of being there. It's not about best cost location for X amount of time, and then later on you may pack up and leave.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. As you say, we're sort of in a complete rejigging of the logic we're doing, and there are several points that come into this. If you are in different continents, you have different preferences and different sort of technological approaches to certain things. So you need to have R&D capability, more D than R in that respect, sort of to adapt the products to the local demands and local requirements. On the other hand, and you're sort of referring to inward investment screening as well as outward investment screening, there is the element of how much IP do you want to risk in certain countries where there is a higher likelihood of that idea being replicated somewhere in the market.
And just coming back with the last question for Eileen, something from the audience, referring back to the first panel today, how does your agency, or how does Ireland as a country fight corruption within the government, within the agency, on the FDI-related front? Is there what do you do to impose some systems that there are no special favoritism towards certain companies and people asking for kickbacks, etc.?
Yeah, that doesn't happen. Okay, so getting back to
We're in Eastern Europe, so please explain that doesn't happen. How does that not happen?
Well, we live in a regulated environment. Okay, so we have protocols that are applied that would mean these things simply don't happen. I'm not explaining this very well, but we live in a regulated environment. Now, I don't think we're over-regulated, we're appropriately regulated. Okay? So we have a series of protocols that we need to adhere to and that our teams adhere to. Quite honestly, I've been doing this a while, and I have never once met an investor that is looking for a kickback. Not once. So I have no experience in it, and my organisation has no experience in it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Martin. And hopefully this was an interesting and valuable discussion for Macedonia as a country going forward to learn from the best how to attract FDIs in the future.